All right, so let's begin. My name is Haley Paul, and I'm the Policy Director for the National Audubon Society here in Arizona. Audubon is a member of the Water for Arizona Coalition, which supports policies and innovative practices to ensure a reliable water supply to meet the state's needs. We're glad to have you today for part 2 of our webinar series titled Groundwater in Rural Arizona, which will explore the topic of Arizona's groundwater, why it's important, how its management or lack thereof affects rural communities, and what tools and solutions exist that actually work. We hope that you will also join us next week, same day, same time, for the final installment of our series. In this webinar, we'll cover how we can protect groundwater resources that Arizona has today by learning about what works in other locations throughout the West. Last week, we had the pleasure of hearing from a panel of community leaders from around the state who talked about the importance of groundwater in their communities and their perspectives on why we need to protect it. Today's section is called Where Did Water Go? And focuses on the impacts of groundwater overuse. This afternoon, Chris Custis of the Environmental Defense Fund and I will be co-presenting. Chris and I are the co-leads of the Water for Arizona Coalition. If you have any questions, you can enter them into the chat box and we'll respond to some of them as we go. So feel free to type in clarifying questions as you have them. And lastly, this webinar is being recorded and we will make it available after the conclusion of this presentation. So here's just a little overview of what we're going to cover in today's presentation. The first 3 sections, which Chris will cover, will review some basics about what groundwater is, why it matters in Arizona, and how we manage it. Audubon did a full webinar on these topics about a year ago, and the recording is available online. We'll post that link in the chat in case you want to dive into more of those topics. For the 4th section, I'll come back to dive into some of the impacts of groundwater overuse that we are seeing across parts of the state. All right, Chris, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Haley. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here today. We'll start this off with the question in front of you. What is groundwater exactly? Groundwater is the water that's found between the cracks, crevices, and spaces between soil, sand, and rocks underground. It's the source of water for springs and wells, and groundwater allows many of Arizona's rivers, springs, and creeks to flow year-round by providing a base flow of water in between snowmelt and rain events. This base flow comes from water that seeps into a river or stream from below underground. Here's a diagram that shows groundwater as the blue water that occurs between the spaces of rock and soil underground. So where does groundwater come from? Natural groundwater recharge happens when rainfall, stream flow, or melting snow percolates or sinks down into the ground. An aquifer is a layer of underground sand, gravel, or permeable rock where the water collects. And the water table is the upper surface of that aquifer that is saturated with water. Here's another visual representation of groundwater, this one with a bit more emphasis on how groundwater and surface water or river water are connected to each other. This representation here is meant to show that as wells pump groundwater, the water table can lower and eventually reduce stream flow that's connected to rivers and springs. This slide shows the different types of aquifers that exist throughout the Western US. Aquifer type affects the quantity, quality, and availability of groundwater, meaning depending on where you are, groundwater can have very different characteristics. Here in Arizona, we primarily have two types of aquifers: the Colorado Plateau aquifers, shown here in the turquoise-like color in the northeastern part of Arizona, and the basin and range basin fill aquifers in the green towards the south and the western part of the state. The main difference between these two primary types of aquifers is geology. The Colorado Plateau aquifers tend to be composed of permeable rock, while the basin fill aquifers tend to be composed of gravel, sand, and silt. And here you can see a diagram, a cross-section of these two aquifers. At the left is the basin and range aquifer type that's primarily found in southern and western Arizona. And on the right are the very deep aquifers of the Colorado Plateau. So across our state, we have very unique geologic features that have allowed large deposits of water to accrue, often over many thousands of years. And while the hydrogeology of these aquifers has allowed for the accrual of quite a bit of water over time, we have to remember that it took many centuries for that water to accrue in our aquifers. And if not managed sustainably, it can take just decades or less to deplete. So the point here is that much of the water we use from aquifers in Arizona is ancient water. And so now, why do we care so much about groundwater? For starters, groundwater makes up about 40% of our state's water supply, as you can see here in this image. And as our Colorado River supply continues shrinking into the future, the proportion of water we use each year that is groundwater will only increase. And also keep in mind that many of our in-state rivers, like the Verde, are also groundwater dependent. And while we're on this slide, I want to add here that the Water for Arizona Coalition, we did a recent survey of 500 likely voters across the state, and 92% of them agreed that ensuring reliable water supplies is important. And to that, I'll say, in a state like Arizona, with a water supply portfolio that looks like this, ensuring a reliable water supply means that groundwater and its protection is very important. And why is groundwater important? Because it is often the main or only source of water for many communities in Arizona. In this great graphic from the Water Resources Research Center at U of A, you can see the percentage of groundwater used versus surface water used in various parts of the state. The blue areas shown here depend primarily on surface water, so water from rivers and lakes and streams, while the green areas depend mainly on groundwater. The gray areas you see have a mix of water supplies. And when you take a careful look here at the gray areas, those places with a mix of water supplies, you can see that significant chunks of the pie charts are green, representing a substantial and important reliance on groundwater. So I'll pause here a moment, let you absorb this graphic if you haven't seen it before, and be sure to check out your part of the state. All right, moving on. So of course, as a major part of our water supply for many communities, groundwater is crucial to the people in those communities, to their businesses, their livelihoods, and the overall economy, both present and future. Our colleagues at the organization Business for Water Stewardship, also a part of our coalition, recently worked with economists at ASU on a study finding that even just looking at groundwater used in the most urban parts of the state, so primarily Phoenix and Tucson areas, Arizona's groundwater can be considered responsible for almost half of the state's annual GDP. So the point here is that continued availability of groundwater and its sustainable management and protection is critical for sustaining healthy economies that support community well-being and ensuring Arizona is a place that can provide economic opportunity and security now and into the future. And one more point on this slide while we're here, this is very important in rural parts of the state where groundwater is the primary or even only water supply, because how groundwater is managed or not will have a major role in shaping what our shared economic future looks like. Okay, and of course, we also care about groundwater because it is absolutely critical to Arizona's rivers, streams, and springs, and helps support our diverse wildlife and ecosystems. Arizona is the most biologically diverse state in the US without a coastline, so third only to California and Texas in the number of different species present here. Groundwater feeds our rivers and springs, and they in turn support riparian habitat that's of outsized importance to our birds, fish, and other wildlife in our desert state. And here's the important part. We Arizonans, we love our rivers. In our recent survey that I mentioned earlier, we found that 86% of the likely voters we surveyed think that conserving our flowing streams and rivers is important. And in addition, 86% of those same likely voters think that keeping rivers from drying up is also important. All right, another slide here. So recent Audubon study found that our state's rivers, lakes, and streams help generate $13.5 billion annually. So we've heard a bit on why groundwater matters in our state. So how is it managed and treated under Arizona laws? Before we do this overview, if you'd like a longer version of this story, you can watch a recording of our Understanding Arizona's Groundwater webinar from last year around this same time. Today, we're just going to. All right, so much of the groundwater law that exists today in Arizona is a result of the 1980 Groundwater Management Act, which was passed in response to declining water levels in the state's most populous urban areas. So again, primarily Tucson and Phoenix areas, as well as some of its largest agricultural areas, in this case, especially Pinal County. The act at the time was considered necessary to, quote, protect and stabilize the general economy and welfare of the state and its citizens. The Groundwater Management Act created two types of special groundwater management areas called AMAs, or active management areas, in the blue toned colors you see here on the map, and INAs, or irrigation non-expansion areas, in the purplish color tone on the map. So there are currently 5 AMAs and 3 ANAs in the state, and the law also defines a process for creating new ones. So to summarize here, groundwater is fairly tightly managed within the AMAs, less so in the INAs, and essentially is not managed or regulated at all outside of these areas, at least outside of the sovereign tribal lands you see here in the gold color. Okay, so diving into a bit more detail, within the AMAs, there's a broad set of programs and requirements used to manage groundwater, and we're briefly going to talk about several of those. So first, within an AMA, a person needs a groundwater right or another kind of permit or authority in order to pump groundwater from non-exempt wells. A note here, so non-exempt wells are smaller wells, pumps that produce less than 35 gallons per minute. Those wells are exempt from most of these requirements. There's also rules governing the allowable impact of new wells, often called well spacing rules, which provide some protection to existing groundwater users. Irrigation also cannot be expanded to new acres within an AMA. So that's acres that were not already irrigated prior to the creation of the AMA. There are also management plans and management goals for each AMA. Management plans contain conservation requirements that are introduced in a new management plan every decade. Although I will also note here, as an aside, the framework for these plans ends in the year 2025, and how we approach going beyond that is an active discussion across the state. And so lastly on this slide, another program, there's also an assured water supply program within the AMAs that applies to new developments and a sophisticated system to account for recharge, storage, and recovery of water underground. All right, so a bit more on the INAs. So although there's a range of requirements within Arizona's AMAs, there is only really one main requirement in the INAs, and that's that irrigation cannot be expanded onto acres that were not already irrigated prior to the creation of the AMA. And here, irrigation essentially means using water to grow crops on 2 or more acres for sale or for people to eat or for animal feed. So the Groundwater Management Act created AMAs and INAs, but outside of these areas, in what we sometimes call greater or rural Arizona, groundwater is still largely unregulated, at least outside sovereign tribal lands. Groundwater in rural Arizona is governed only by the legal doctrine of reasonable use. And under this legal doctrine that exists in most of Arizona, a landowner may withdraw and use groundwater for any reasonable and beneficial use. The reasonable use doctrine doesn't require anyone to get a water right or to evaluate how one's pumping might affect the groundwater supply of others' access to water at the same supply. So what this means in practice is that in most of Arizona, a landowner may initiate a new water use and pump and withdraw groundwater, even if that causes declines or dries up neighboring wells. And even if in total the amount of water that's being withdrawn exceeds what is recharged into the aquifer, leading to depletion of long-term and collective water supplies. And even if that pumping depletes the water flowing in connected rivers, streams, or springs, interfering not only with the river or stream itself and the riparian vegetation that's supported by it, but as you can see here, also interfering potentially with established surface water uses. And all of this, of course, can lead to conflicts among users. Conflicts are made worse in some areas by what is sometimes called Arizona's bifurcated water law, meaning that surface water and groundwater are largely treated as 2 different things under the law. Even though they are often surface water and groundwater, intimately connected in real life, and thus what hydrogeologists refer to as a single resource. So there's one additional wrinkle here, there always is in the Arizona water law, which is we don't have time to go into this much today, but just want to mention it. There is also a category of water called subflow in Arizona, which is water that is pumped from underground, but that Arizona courts determined to be so closely connected to surface water that it is actually surface water under the law and thus requires a water right and a priority date in order to use. But so far, in most parts of the state, it hasn't been finally determined who is pumping this thing called subflow, or what will happen to those pumpers who have a well, are found to be pumping subflow, which is actually surface water under the law, but don't go through the administrative process that's required to acquire a surface water right. And this greatly complicates and intensifies the challenges in some parts of our state. Again, this is the state legal doctrine here, reasonable use, that applies throughout most of rural Arizona, outside of the AMAs and INAs. And quote, rural Arizona isn't necessarily completely rural anymore. It includes some fast growing areas. The areas outside the AMAs make up about 80% of the state's footprint and are now home to about 1.5 million people. So almost wrapping up my sections here, I should also mention that everything we've talked about so far is the state law that applies to most of the groundwater resources in Arizona. But there is a different set of law that governs groundwater that is connected to the Colorado River, since that is a multi-state river. And there is also a separate set of federal law governing water rights associated with Native American lands and with federal lands such as national parks or forests. Tribal reservations in particular usually have their own unique federal water rights to which a different set of rules apply. However, for 11 of Arizona's 22 federally recognized tribes, these unique rights have not yet been fully confirmed and fulfilled. And in the meantime, pumping outside of sovereign tribal lands of reservations can affect the water resources that will ultimately be available to these tribes. So with that, that's our quick trip through Arizona groundwater management. And back to you, Haley.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for that overview. Really helpful in setting the stage. Can you guys hear me okay? Give me a thumbs up if you can, Chris. Yes, you can hear me okay? Okay, thanks. So we've seen groundwater is essentially unregulated outside of the AMAs in Arizona, and the consequences are already showing up in different communities across the state. We'll talk about a whole suite of potential impacts of overpumping and examples of what we're seeing across Arizona. But to summarize, just so that you know what we're going to talk about, we see impacts in all of these categories: declining groundwater levels, impacts to existing wells, land subsidence, diminishment of community water supplies. There's water quality risks, declining water levels in rivers and streams, as Chris mentioned. And then also what Chris mentioned, there's conflicts among neighbors. Let's dive in. We'll start with the declines in groundwater levels, and a closely related concept, declines in the amount of water remaining underground, or groundwater storage. So this image comes from satellite data, and it's the NASA GRACE satellite, which is able to measure changes in shallow groundwater by measuring anomalies in Earth's gravity field. This map shows that shallow groundwater storage as of March 29th, 2021, that's what this map is a snapshot of. The colors depict how the amount of groundwater compares to long-term records for the month. Blue areas have more abundant water than usual, and orange and red areas have less. Some of these dark red colors that you are seeing covering Arizona and much of the West likely represent longer term changes and trends in the amount of groundwater available underground, though some may also be associated with the current multi-decade drought. So zooming in from that satellite view of the country, on the ground or underground really, we can see declines in groundwater levels, a lowering of the water table in certain areas that can indicate an overall decrease in the amount of groundwater available. Remember, we said that as wells withdraw groundwater, the water table can decline. So this map comes from an interactive app produced by the ASU Kyle Center, and I highly encourage you to check it out, with data from the Arizona Department of Water Resources, and it's publicly available, and we'll put the link in the chat box so you can check it out. The map shows the groundwater level changes in specific wells over the last 20 years. These wells are called index wells, and they are visited by the department on a regular basis to collect groundwater level data. There are about 1,800 index wells across the state. In this map, circle size indicates the amount of change. So larger circles indicate greater change, and the color indicates the rise in blue or decline in red in the groundwater level. You can see there are some areas throughout the state where there have been significant declines in groundwater levels. Most of the places where we are seeing increasing groundwater levels are in the Phoenix and Tucson metro regions or within AMAs, where they have had access to renewable water supplies like the Verde, Salt, and Colorado rivers, and a groundwater management system in place. So you can also see with this map that there are many places across the state where we do not have index wells and lack the ability to track changes in groundwater levels over time. For example, look at the northern part of the state, near Flagstaff and the Grand Canyon, and to the east, west, and north. While the USGS does also have some wells that it monitors in these areas, there are nonetheless large gaps in the available data. So this slide zooms in on declines in water levels that the Arizona Department of Water Resources has observed in its index wells in the last 10 years in a few groundwater basins that may be among those hot spots for groundwater declines. The Wilcox Basin is in green, the McMullen Basin is in blue, and the Wallapai Basin, which supplies water to the city of Kingman, is the red one in the northwest part of the state. So zooming in even further, in 2016, ADWR released a report that analyzed water use and water level changes in the Douglas and Wilcox Basins and the San Simon Valley subbasins in southeastern Arizona. These are just a few graphs of water level changes in the Wilcox Basin selected from the report, but show that over the last several decades, water levels have declined between tens and hundreds of feet. Of the 392 wells measured, 339 wells had declining water levels. 42 wells showed rising water levels and 12 wells showed no change. The median water level change was a decline of 23.7 feet, and the median rate of change was a loss of 2.5 feet per year. Simply put, in some places, the water table is dropping by 25 feet every decade. And that's significant. So we're seeing declining water levels. Along with declining water levels can come land subsidence. Land subsidence generally occurs when groundwater pumping exceeds the rates of recharge, leading to overdraft. As groundwater levels decline, the small pores, cracks, and crevices where groundwater occurs, they begin to close in on themselves and collapse, causing the land to literally sink. So the image on the right shows the land subsidence in the Wilcox Basin, where subsidence rates have nearly tripled between 1996 and 2015. The darker red colors indicate areas of greater subsidence. Current subsidence rates are estimated at roughly 4 inches per year. In some areas, the land has sunk as much as 32 inches, close to 3 feet in a decade. And this has resulted in significant earth fissures, which have impacted roads and pipelines. Land subsidence also causes longer-term water storage issues because as the land sinks in on itself, it becomes more compacted. The small pores where water used to be are now closed off. And ultimately, we're reducing that total amount of groundwater storage that we can store and be available underground. So subsidence has also occurred in the McMullen Valley. In some areas, the land surface has lowered by 16 inches, which has resulted in a number of fissures. So we talked about a decline in groundwater levels that can come with pumping. And as more wells pump groundwater, the water table can drop even further, sometimes drying up wells, requiring them to be deepened if the well owner wants to continue accessing groundwater. And indeed, as groundwater levels decline, we're also seeing impacts to existing wells and existing water users. As we said, in rural Arizona, there is no requirement for those who are developing new wells to assess what impact they will have on other nearby wells. In parts of the state, new, large, and deep wells are being drilled, in some cases by large out-of-state or international agricultural ventures, and this is leading to neighboring wells, sometimes of long-standing residents, drying up. Newspaper articles have even been reporting about some families who have bought homes only to have their wells dry up within a few years, leaving them without water. Sometimes new, large agricultural wells are displacing even smaller farms who have shallower wells. In some cases, drilling a new well could cost tens of thousands of dollars. This can be cost prohibitive for a smaller operation or an individual resident. And in some cases, especially in a shallower aquifer or along its edge, it may not even be possible to drill a productive replacement well on your property after a well goes dry. This is a quote from a farmer in Cochise County in an article published just last month about the impact of deep new wells drilled by a large dairy operation nearby. "We weren't ready to quit. We just got new equipment. When they started drilling those deep wells, it ruined my dream." And this is from a La Paz County homeowner who spent $16,000 of retirement money drilling a new well after her first well dried up, and wonders how long the new well will last. "Half of me feels like we ought to just sell out now if we can get a good price and get the heck out of here before we run out of water. The other half says, you love it here. You've worked for 20 years to build this place up. So I don't think I should feel forced to sell my home just to feel safe." Much of the information we have about homeowners' wells drying up is from recent journalism on the topic. Neither state nor local government comprehensively tracks wells that go dry, nor what the outcome is for homeowners and landowners. So, of course, unconstrained groundwater pumping also has implications for communities' water supplies as a whole. One of the most dramatic examples is in Kingman, where the Wallapai Basin, which is the primary source of Kingman's water, may, according to one study, have as few as 60 years of accessible groundwater remaining, at least without getting down into very deep water. Groundwater pumping for agricultural use began very recently in the Wallapai Basin, in 2014 for the irrigation of alfalfa crops, and then starting in 2016, irrigation of orchards. A 2019 report commissioned by ADWR modeled groundwater depletion if land then owned by known farming operations was irrigated over time, based on different possible crop mixes of alfalfa and orchards, and projected that in fewer than 60 years, groundwater levels could reach 1,200 feet below the ground, a depth beyond which groundwater is no longer considered physically available under the state's adequate water supply regulations. And then just last year, the USGS completed a different modeling report. Actually, it was just published 2 days ago, and presented projections based on different assumptions regarding agriculture. So they thought there might be, including lower water use crops on fewer acres of irrigated agricultural land. And because of those assumptions, concluded that if those play out, approximately an extra 100 years of groundwater may remain above that 1,200 feet threshold. What's really the point here, I think it's worth noting that neither report looked at the possibility of new land being purchased and put into agricultural production, and there's nothing to stop that from happening. Whatever the future holds, it's clear that the future of water supplies in this area is precarious, while local communities have little authority to actually influence which assumptions will play out in the future. Ultimately, the lack of tools and authorities to protect rural groundwater will be a problem not just for Kingman, but for many Arizona communities. Since, as Chris told us, most communities in non-AMA Arizona are dependent on groundwater as a primary or even sole source of water. Some communities also rely on water from groundwater-fed rivers and streams, so those supplies are also at risk. And although we have focused so far today on groundwater on non-tribal lands, it is also important to consider that even off-reservation groundwater pumping can impact water supplies and springs and streams on reservation, and that those water supplies are relied on by sovereign tribal nations. The Havasupai depend on water in spring-fed Havasu Creek, for example, and have previously tried, unsuccessfully as of yet, to use the court system to try to protect the waters on their reservation and their ancestral lands from depletion caused by nearby groundwater pumping. And especially when we're talking about community water supplies, the water supplies that feed cities, it's important to also mention water quality. In general, areas of intensive groundwater pumping, we can sometimes see impacts to water quality. There was a recent study out of the USGS focusing on California's Central Valley that concluded that in general, water quality problems from existing groundwater pollution can grow worse and faster when pumping increases during drought. For example, in this case, nitrate pollution from fertilizer, which had been concentrated in more shallow groundwater, was sucked down deeper into aquifers usually used for drinking water supplies when groundwater pumping increased due to drought conditions. In Arizona, much, though certainly not all, of the groundwater relied upon in rural areas is currently of fairly high quality, but as pumping increases, contamination concerns also increase. When groundwater is a primary community water supply, it becomes essential not to protect only its quantity, but also its quality. The Navajo Nation is still dealing with uranium contamination of its lands and waters from uranium mining that occurred in the mid-20th century, and some Northern Arizona stakeholders are concerned about what is happening again if uranium mining is allowed to proceed and expand near the Grand Canyon. So, in addition to impacts on groundwater levels, individual wells, and community water supplies, we've seen and are seeing the impacts of unconstrained groundwater pumping on rivers, streams, and springs, and more are at risk in the future. We'll first consider the story of the Santa Cruz River. Historically, the river flowed perennially or year-round from its headwaters in the San Rafael Valley to about 11 miles north of Tubac. By the 1980s, surface flow was ephemeral, which means flowing briefly, following storm events, or intermittent, flowing more seasonally. The top photo shows the river's headwaters in the San Rafael Valley in southern Arizona. The bottom photo shows a reach of effluent-dominated flow that occurs downstream of the Nogales International Wastewater Treatment Plant, very highly treated wastewater or effluent. Let's see if I can say this right. Guavavi Mission, 6 miles north of the US-Mexican border, was founded by Jesuit missionary Father Kino in 1691. Guavavi may have come from a Spanish derivative, Gusutaki, meaning big water, referring to the fact that water was consistently available in the stream bed. At this site, once flowing reaches of the river are now dry. Downstream, the Santa Cruz through Tucson historically had perennial flow, sustaining cottonwood and willow galleries and mesquite bosques. The river in this area is now usually dry, except in sections where the Tohono O'odham Nation and City of Tucson have restored stretches with CAP water or treated wastewater. Not just flow, but vegetation and cienagas have been lost. Cienagas, which are marshes, are a regional type of groundwater-dependent wetland that have historically been abundant along the upper Santa Cruz River. Historic changes in water table conditions from groundwater withdrawals have reduced these large expanses of cienagas to tiny remnants of what they once were. Let's go to the Verde River. The Verde River flows near Paulden on the Colorado Plateau to its confluence with the Salt River outside of Phoenix. It supports an abundance of wildlife, unique cottonwood mesquite gallery forests, and supplies drinking water to the Phoenix metro area and irrigation water within the Verde Valley. The groundwater that feeds the river is also the water supply for both the Prescott and Chino Valley area and the Verde Valley, including places like Cottonwood, Sedona, and Camp Verde. The springs that used to feed the Verde River's headwaters and were the water supply for areas as far away as the Grand Canyon have been dried up. Del Rio Springs are the iconic Arizona springs that used to form the headwaters of the Verde River. But over time, as groundwater development increased in the Prescott area, water levels in the Little Chino groundwater subbasin dropped, ultimately depleting Del Rio Springs to an inconsistent trickle. When combined with agricultural diversions of surface water, this has left about 5 miles of what used to be the Verde River's headwaters without water. And this 2013 study by the USGS found that water levels in the Verde River have declined by as much as 10,000 acre-feet a year, or 8% of its annual flow, because of groundwater pumping over the last century. And experts anticipate that without deliberate action, further miles of river in the Verde headwaters will dry up and be lost, and that the middle Verde around Clarkdale and through Camp Verde will be significantly degraded. The Spring Stewardship Institute has completed a study of springs in the Verde Basin. They surveyed 717, though detailed inventories were available for fewer, but they found that base flow is declining in springs throughout the area due to both groundwater pumping and decreases in natural recharge from rain and snowmelt caused by climate change. Montezuma Well, shown here, is one of the best known Verde River area springs. The same study by the Spring Stewardship Institute notes that Montezuma Well supports the highest concentration of unique species of any point in North America, to the researchers' knowledge. Birds, fish, and other wildlife depend on the groundwater that feeds springs and the Verde River and its tributaries. The water sustains ribbons of precious riparian habitat. Let's go to another famous desert river, the San Pedro River. It's very valuable and also very threatened. Flowing through southeastern Arizona, it originates in Sonora, Mexico, and empties into the Gila River near Winkleman, Arizona, 170 miles to the north. The San Pedro Riparian National Conservation Area, affectionately known as SPRNCA, is the area along the river and outlined in pink on this map. It was established in 1988 to protect the river and riparian resources of this part of the San Pedro, including its cottonwood gallery forest and the birds and other wildlife that rely on it. The upper San Pedro Basin includes habitat for 389 avian species, 84 species of mammals, and 47 reptile and amphibian species. And scientists have documented that groundwater supports base flows in the San Pedro River. They have also found that wells remove water at 240% of the natural recharge rate, causing a large and growing deficit in the amount of water that goes into the river and groundwater system versus what comes out. According to Juliet Stromberg and others, the continuous presence of surface flow in the river, along with the shallow groundwater that supports it, allows riparian habitat to exist. Scientists tell us that if historical trends continue, declines in groundwater levels due to pumping will eventually reduce base flow in the river and damage the riparian vegetation within the SPRNCA that we just showed you. So the San Pedro River is one of the few remaining free-flowing perennial rivers in the desert Southwest, but it has lost more than 50% of its perennial length. Here you can see maps of the river's documented flow over time. Every June, groups of volunteers organized by the Nature Conservancy walk the entire 170-mile length of the San Pedro River and record where it is wet and where it is dry during the hottest, driest time of the year. There's an animation that's available online that we'll put in the chat, and you can see 20 years worth of data on summertime surface flows in the San Pedro River within the SPRNCA. These observations were recorded by community scientists through the wet-dry mapping project I mentioned. What we are seeing, and you can see this in the animation, basically are the results of the data that they have collected, showing that significant stretches of perennial year-round flow do remain within the SPRNCA, and also showing annual variability, which can indicate changes in local groundwater conditions and may provide an early warning of ecological changes. So this graph from a USGS study last updated in 2019 shows declining base flows in the San Pedro River at each of the 4 measured gauges over the period of record. The y-axis we're seeing is the base flow in cubic feet per second, and the x-axis is years from 1930 to 2010. Each different color is a different USGS stream gauge along the upper San Pedro River. The report states that these declines indicate that groundwater pumping from the Sierra Vista and Fort Huachuca areas are capturing water that would otherwise have discharged to the riparian area and near stream aquifer that feed the San Pedro River. So lots of USGS reports, which we're so grateful for. The same USGS study reports on an array of indicators that help paint a picture of groundwater sustainability in the area near the San Pedro River, called the Sierra Vista subwatershed. Stay with me. Many collaborative efforts have been undertaken to help improve the outlook for the river in this area. For example, the Cochise Conservation and Recharge Network has helped to deploy a combination of water conservation, reuse, recharge, and augmentation projects in the area. Implemented by the Upper San Pedro Partnership and its member agencies, 13 billion gallons of water have been saved or used to replenish groundwater at its 8 water conservation and replenishment sites along 25 miles of the Upper San Pedro River, certainly an accomplishment. However, the USGS study found that in 2012, hydrologic conditions in many parts of the Sierra Vista sub-watershed were stable or improving, especially locations adjacent to conservation and replenishment projects. Well, while these projects have helped restore water to the river, overall, a deficit remains. Projections of future groundwater pumping and impacts to river flows suggest that base flow will continue to decline unless pumping can be further reduced or recharge substantially increased. So feel free to really give this graphic a good look. I think it's really helpful. The USGS found that even if pumping across the area were to completely stop tomorrow, the cone of depression, which is the area where immediate pumping impacts are observed, would continue to spread, and its effects, including reducing stream flow by intercepting groundwater that should be flowing towards the river, would continue for decades. And this is a conceptual representation of that groundwater surface water connection with the positive intervention of the benefits that come from a groundwater recharge project and how they can mitigate the effects of that cone of depression. Pretty interesting. So we're gonna go from Southern Arizona back to Northern Arizona and turn our attention to the springs and the streams and creeks that are fed by springs in the Grand Canyon area. So first, we will look at what are springs exactly, and specifically how they occur in the Grand Canyon. So springs are places where groundwater is exposed at the Earth's surface. Frequently, springs are flowing, but many times they'll appear just as a moist seep out of the ground. This is an illustration that shows how groundwater moves beneath the ground on the Colorado Plateau in northern Arizona. Spring water comes from infiltration of snowpack and rainfall at higher elevation. That water seeps into thousands of feet of rock layers until it reaches layers it can no longer penetrate, and then it moves laterally, emerging from the side of the canyon. The spring source, represented in the blue dots you see, is the place where water exists or discharges from the ground. So these valuable water sources provide essential water to habitat and support sensitive ecosystems. Riparian habitats occur at springs, seeps, and short stream segments fed by springs. And consider this, springs support a species diversity 100 to 500 times greater than the surrounding landscapes. But as growth and development and continued drought increase stress on the shallower aquifers of the Coconino Plateau, it is becoming more common to drill wells into the deeper aquifer. This raises concerns about the health of spring and seep flows that discharge into the Grand Canyon. In fact, decreasing flow has been observed at 2 springs below the South Rim between 1994 and 2004. There has been a 19% decrease in the flow of Cottonwood Springs and a 25% decrease at Indian Garden Springs. This is another neat story, another cool spring in the Grand Canyon. Roaring Center Spring is an example of where groundwater is exposed at the Earth's surface. This is a large spring area that runs for half a mile and gushes out of a limestone cave below the north rim of the Grand Canyon. This spring is a vital source of water, providing reliable year-round water to a very diverse ecosystem in an arid environment, as well as providing drinking water for visitors and residents of the Grand Canyon National Park. A portion of the water from this spring is transported through a 12.5-mile-long pipeline to the bottom of the canyon and back up to supply water at the south rim of the Grand Canyon. And so before leaving the Grand Canyon area, we'll just briefly mention the Little Colorado River, which flows from its headwaters in eastern New Mexico across northeastern Arizona and to its confluence with the Colorado River inside the Grand Canyon National Park, a confluence considered sacred by the Hopi tribe and other indigenous people. The Little Colorado River is intermittent or ephemeral in some areas and perennial in others, where it is fed by water from snowmelt or springs. And groundwater pumping has begun to impact portions of the Little Colorado River and its tributaries as well. Select reaches of Clear Creek, Chevelon Creek, and the Little Colorado River were studied to evaluate impacts of pumping. Results showed withdrawals from wells caused about a 6% reduction of base flows. Additional pumping is likely to impact spring flows. All right. Overall, unconstrained groundwater pumping in Arizona has already depleted the flow in numerous rivers, streams, and springs, and threatens to continue to do so. Already in Arizona, 35% of the river miles that once flowed freely year-round no longer do. One 2007 study conducted by the Nature Conservancy found that of 18 Arizona watersheds studied, 7 significant river stretches could be completely dewatered based on future municipal groundwater pumping alone, as projected through 2050. Without deliberate and substantial conservation actions, 4 other rivers could experience substantial degradation. And in general, all of these challenges that we've discussed so far lead to conflicts, as water users, including communities, farmers, homeowners, businesses, face declining water supplies and a lack of recourse or ability to do anything about it. Individual water users don't have good tools to address these issues because they are not built into the law. And even local communities, cities, towns, and counties have limited authorities to manage groundwater. Under Arizona law, local jurisdictions generally don't have broad authority over their water resources unless the state legislature chooses to give them that authority. And there's nothing to stop us from continuing to add to the problem because there is nothing in our law that prevents us from drilling new wells in most areas. These challenges continue intensifying as predictably new wells continue to proliferate in many areas across the state. Here in these animations, we can see how the number of wells have increased just since 1980 in a variety of groundwater basins throughout the state. This is the Wallapai Basin near Kingman. And if you go to the next slide, I'll read a little bit more and we can keep checking out different parts of the state. Thanks. In these images, the larger orange circles are larger wells, more than 35 gallons per minute, and the smaller red circles are smaller wells. This is the Wilcox Groundwater Basin, which is certainly a hot spot in the state. And we can go to the Verde River Basin, which has lots of surface water supplies and also lots of groundwater development. And you can see that often they're occurring near rivers and streams. We'll take you on a couple more journeys. Here's the Big Sandy in the northwest part of the state. It has important riparian habitat. And then last but not least, the Cienega Creek Groundwater Basin, which is an interesting groundwater basin because it's where the tributaries to the Santa Cruz and the San Pedro actually originate. So in summary, we are seeing the impacts of unconstrained groundwater pumping showing up in different places across Arizona outside of the active management areas. And there's little in current Arizona law to support communities that wish to address these challenges and plan for their future. This is not to say, however, that solutions don't exist. The main challenge here is the lack of tools in Arizona water law, but we can change that, and now is the time. Your community should have a say in its water future. So we hope you will join us for next week's final webinar in our series, sharing perspective and stories about groundwater management solutions that have been implemented in other states, important choices and policy conversations, and the state of the conversation in Arizona, and get involved in the dialogue that's growing throughout the state. We will put in the chat 2 important upcoming opportunities to get involved in these groundwater issues. As we heard from our panelists during last week's webinar, it is critical that more perspectives are heard by our decision makers. By joining this webinar, you will receive updates from Audubon's Western Rivers Action Network, but you might also consider signing up for updates from our Water for Arizona Coalition, and we will do our best to keep you informed when these type of opportunities come up. So just a reminder of who we are at the Water for Arizona Coalition, and I know the links are being dropped in the chat. We hope you will take advantage of those and get involved and lend your voice. It's critically needed for this really important issue. And with that, we'll end with our contact information. Please feel free to reach out. If you signed up for this webinar, you will also get a recording of it. We really appreciate your time and attention. We know that was a lot of information thrown out at you, but we hope that you can have those in your back pocket when you need to make a point, and this resource will be available for you as a recording later in the week. I think we've reached our time, so I don't think we'll have time for questions, but what we're doing is gathering all the questions, and then we're gonna try to do kind of an answer at the end of this whole webinar series. We'll send out an email to those who participated. So with that, I appreciate everyone's time and attention, and greatly appreciate your tuning into this webinar. Thank you.